This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Laura Trevelyan. President Trump is in Miami, where he's called for Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro to step down, amid questions over how far the US will go to oust him. The Huawei boss hits back. In an exclusive interview, he says his company doesn't spy for China's government, calling US charges against his firm politically motivated.
This is where the tornado entered town from the south.
Plus, rebuilding a city on renewable energy. How Greensburg, Kansas became an environmental pioneer after a natural disaster. Welcome to World News America. This President's Day, Donald Trump is increasing the pressure on Venezuela's embattled leader, Nicolas Maduro. Mr. Trump is in Miami tonight, where he's throwing his support behind the opposition leader, Juan Guaido. South Florida has one of the largest Venezuelan populations in the US. Mr. Trump is pushing for the removal of Nicolas Maduro from power, and he's calling for aid to be allowed into Venezuela.
Socialism is dying, and liberty, prosperity, and democracy are being reborn. Today, our hearts are filled with hope because of the determination of millions of everyday Venezuelans, the patriotism of the Venezuelan National Assembly, and the incredible courage of interim President Juan Guaido.
And joining me now for more on Mr. Trump's speech and the situation in Venezuela is Michael Shifter. He's president of the Inter-American Dialogue. So, Michael, you see there the president is really turning the screws on Nicolas Maduro. You're just back from the region. Do you think it's working?
Well, so far it hasn't, and the administration seems very impatient. They want the armed forces basically to turn from Maduro to Guaido, and with that the government will collapse. And they are tightening the screws. There are economic sanctions. There's lots of hints about possible military intervention. I don't think that's probable, but they're certainly using a lot of bravado and a lot of aggressive rhetoric. And this, of course, the Trump speech steps it up. But so far, we haven't seen any indication that that the high levels of the armed forces are really ready to give in.
We do know, or it's been reported, that the president openly asked his aides in 2017 if it would be possible to have a US military invasion to get rid of Mr. Maduro, but you think it's not really on the cards?
No, I don't think so. I think we're withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and Syria. I doubt we're going to put troops in Venezuela. There may be some other approaches, but certainly military intervention of sending troops on the ground, boots on the ground, I think is very, very unlikely.
So Juan Guaido has been recognized as the interim leader. There are all of these very punishing US sanctions. There are calls for this aid to be delivered. Does the US have a plan B if this doesn't oust Maduro?
It doesn't seem so. Senator Rubio said in a speech here a week ago when asked if there's a plan B, he said there's no plan B. He's certainly somebody who's very influential on U.S. policy towards Venezuela. The betting is, the gamble is that with this very tough rhetoric and lots of threats and ultimatums directed at the generals in Venezuela, that they will turn, that they will flip and go to Guaido. That's the thinking, that's the calculus. I have my doubts. I'm a little bit skeptical if that's going to be very successful.
Well, isn't it just possible that this intervention tonight by President Trump, actually what it does is shore up Maduro and show that indeed the US is directly trying to get rid of him?
Yes, I think that's a very, very likely reaction. The armed forces perhaps would like to see a change, but if they hear this rhetoric from Washington, from a foreign power giving them ultimatums and threats, then it may be completely counterproductive, and they may become even stronger together. They will come together to fight the imperialism from the United States. And the other point is that this kind of rhetoric does not help keep the other Latin American governments on board with the U.S. in its approach towards Venezuela. I'm sure throughout Latin America, hearing these very tough words, they're very uneasy about this approach.
Now, the EU's talking about a peaceful transition of power. What would that look like?
Well, I think it is. I think Maduro, President Maduro, does have his days numbered, and I think the opposition is more united than ever. The pressure is very intense, both within this hemisphere and also the major European countries. And so I think there needs to be a negotiation of some sort to give some protection or some guarantees to armed forces who are guilty of human rights violations, corruption, and other criminal activity. So that's going to be very complicated. I think it will take a long time, as we've seen in other transitions throughout the world.
Michael Shifter, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, the founder of Chinese tech